Laura Branigan ignored a persistent 2-week headache. The pain ultimately silenced a 4-octave legacy. The undetected brain aneurysm ended the life of the icon dominating the 1980s dance floor. While history remembers a disco product, the archives reveal a trained opera singer trapped in the systemic machinery of Atlantic Records. The 1982 Gloria phenomenon was no fluke. The record staged a 36-week data-driven siege. Why did the century's most powerful instrument vanish into a decade of silence? Was the exit a choice or a corporate erasure? The architecture of shyness is a silent prison. For Laura Branigan, this prison was a house in Armonk, New York, where vocal performance was the family language, but public expression was a terrifying anomaly. Born in 1952, the fourth of 5 children, Branigan's childhood was a paradox of domestic noise and social silence. Her grandmother had studied opera in Ireland, and her parents possessed voices that could fill every room, yet Laura remained retreating until her senior year of high school. This was the 0 Point, a 1970 production of The Pajama Game. Under the direction of Jean Bissell, the girl who barely spoke found a vessel for her spirit. The stage didn't just offer a role, it provided a fundamental structure for a confidence she could never find in reality. Following her 1970 graduation, Branigan moved to Manhattan, trading the quiet of Westchester for the abrasive sensory reality of the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Here, the training was as much about survival as it was about craft. To pay tuition, she worked as a waitress, a role she later identified as her most critical preparation for stardom. In the heat of New York diners, she learned the mechanics of human comfort and the vital skill of ignoring hecklers. This was her vocational baptism. While her 1972 folk rock group Meadow disintegrated under the systemic failures of Paramount Records, the experience pushed her into the Tower of Song as a backup vocalist for the legendary Leonard Cohen. As documented by Jim Devlin in his book, Is This What You Wanted?, the 1976 European tour with Cohen served as the catalyst for her solo ambition. Across 56 concerts, including a pivotal night at the Olympia in Paris, Branigan learned the architecture of high-concept performance. However, she famously stated that this experience cemented her desire to never be a background singer again. She sought the solo spotlight, a journey that led her to manager Sid Bernstein and eventually into the orbit of Atlantic Records. This trajectory from the shyness of Armonk to the baptism of the European stage established the foundation for a global anomaly. But while the voice was now a weapon, the industry was preparing a cage of its own. In the high-stakes theater of 1980s pop, success is rarely a lightning strike. It is more often a siege. Laura Branigan's pivot into global hegemony began in 1979 inside the intimate confines of Nasuhi Ertegun's apartment. There, over a very good piano, she performed a raw audition for the chairman of Atlantic Records, Ahmet Ertegun. Ertegun's assessment was immediate. She possessed a great pop voice in the classical sense, a sensational delivery that marked her as a winner. Yet the corporate machinery stalled. Her first project, Silver Dreams, was shelved, a victim of label hesitation and a sound that did not yet fit the prevailing industry architecture. The catalyst for change was a German transmutation. Producer Jack White introduced a Europop approach, selecting Umberto Tozzi's Italian hit, Gloria, and rebuilding it for the American sensory palette. This wasn't a mere cover, it was a fundamental reconstruction. White utilized Branigan's signature vocal sob, a natural emotional ache, to provide a human counterpoint to the increasingly synthetic landscape of the 1980s. The result was an anthem that prioritized emotional resonance over disco artifice. The data reveals the sheer scale of this conquest. Gloria did not just chart, it occupied the airwaves. According to official reports from Billboard, the track spent a record-setting 36 weeks on the Hot 100, the longest residency for a solo female artist at that point in history. It peaked at number 2 in the United States and hit number 1 in Australia and Canada, eventually racking up platinum sales of over 2 million copies. However, the paradox of this triumph was the legal breach it created. As the song became the definitive summer beach anthem of 1982, a $15 million lawsuit surfaced from her former manager, Sid Bernstein, following her move to manager Susan Joseph. Stardom had arrived, but it brought the sharks of the industry with it. This period solidified Branigan not as a one-hit wonder, but as a systemic force within Atlantic Records. The subsequent success of Solitaire and Self-Control proved that her instrument could dominate any market it touched.
But while the charts could measure her reach, they could not quantify the technical engine driving the voice. To understand why she outlasted her contemporaries, we must examine the ancient architecture hidden within her modern delivery.
The 1980s were a landscape defined by silicon artifice and processed perfection, yet Laura Branigan remained a biological anomaly. While her contemporaries leaned on the crutch of emerging synthesizer technology, Branigan's instrument was anchored in an ancient classical architecture. As explained by James Stark in his book Bel Canto, A History of Vocal Pedagogy, this phenomenon is known as the chiaroscuro timbre, a sophisticated vocal strategy where bright, chiara, and dark, oscura, tones achieve a perfect resonant synthesis. Branigan possessed a stunning four-octave range, an elastic alto that allowed her to deliver what critics termed vocal firepower with the precision of a trained opera singer. Unlike the thin, breathy quality of the era's non-classical pop, Branigan utilized a well-balanced amount of subglottic pressure and a stable, low positioning of the larynx, the hallmarks of the Italian bel canto school. This academic anchor is precisely why she could stand diva to diva with vocal titans like Celine Dion. Her performance of Power of Love in 1987 featured an ear-spinning keychain and a soaring finale that remains a benchmark of technical mastery. She was a trained acoustic powerhouse navigating an amplified electronic world, a paradox that gave her music a sonorous and unforced quality that was increasingly rare in the pop hegemony.
However, technical perfection alone does not create a legend. Simon Frith, in his book Performing Rights on the Value of Popular Music, argues that the pop voice is a site of identity performance, where the singer colludes with the audience. Branigan's sob, the inherent emotional ache Gordon Elliott noted as her signature, was her most authentic performance of this right, bridging the gap between clinical pedagogy and raw vulnerability. She wasn't just hitting notes, she was orchestrating a knowing community through the sheer emotional weight of her delivery. This technical depth ensured her work was built to last, even as the industry began to shift toward disposable icons. Yet this very mastery would soon collide with the systemic inertia of a record label that viewed artists as commodities rather than architects.
The deepest layer of the Branigan narrative is the paradox of her success within the house that Ahmet built. Atlantic Records was founded on the bedrock of jazz and soul, an institution of high art and profound commercialism. Yet by the mid-1980s, the label was caught in the systemic machinery of what author Dan Charnas describes in his book The Big Payback as the era of predatory commodification. This was the age of the blockbuster hit, a period where the music industry began to value the mirage of marketability over the fundamental architecture of talent. Consequently, Branigan became a high-performance engine in a system that was increasingly prioritizing disposable products. The paradox was total. While Ahmet Ertegun viewed her as a technical winner with a classical pop voice, the executive pivot toward leaders like Doug Morris signaled a reorganization of the label's soul. As the decade progressed, Branigan's sound was viewed by the hierarchy as a relic of post-disco hegemony, even as she reached her technical peak. By the time of the album Touch in 1987, she was entering what critics called the skids. In a desperate act of agency, she began learning to produce her own tracks, attempting to reclaim her voice from a corporate architecture that was already scouting for talent-free dance divas who were easier to package and control.
This was the predatory capitalism of the 1980s. Use the artist's firepower to build the institution, then lock them out of the rooms once the fashion shifts. The legal battlefield further illustrated this systemic rot. The $15 million breach of contract lawsuit from her first manager, Sid Bernstein, served as a catalyst that drained her momentum just as she reached the summit. As documented in Frederick Dannen's Hitmen, the music business of this era was a landscape of statistical manipulation, where an artist's longevity was often sacrificed for immediate chart dominance. Branigan was a vocal architect in an industry that treated architects as disposable assets. This systemic inertia didn't just stall her career, it forced her into a transgressive visual pivot to prove she still held the keys to the cultural zeitgeist.
The night is not a time, it is a transgressive architecture. In 1984, Laura Branigan stepped into this subterranean world with Self-Control, a project that fundamentally reorganized the boundaries between pop promotion and high-concept cinema. To execute this vision, Branigan bypassed the standard industry hacks and recruited an anomaly, William Friedkin, the Oscar-winning director of The Exorcist and The French Connection. This was the zero point for the cinematic music video. Friedkin didn't deliver a montage of performance clips. He constructed a short film, a circular day-night cycle of escape that utilized the Kuleshov effect and complex dissolves to create a dreamlike fictional reality. The sensory reality of the video is startlingly prescient. Years before Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, Friedkin utilized masked figures and empty urban hallways to explore themes of stalking, seduction, and the creatures of the night. The narrative follows Branigan from her stark bedroom into a debauched club basement, lured by a phantom figure representing the seductive weight of the night itself. Consequently, the video functions as a transgressive space that scholars like Simona Castricum argue appropriates queer aesthetics and liminal spaces of permission to reject the controlled social order of the day.
The paradox lies in the systemic reaction. MTV, the gatekeeper of the era's visual hegemony, deemed the video too sexually explicit due to an orgy-type scene, forcing a censored edit. Branigan's defense was piercing. She questioned the cultural double standards on physicality, claiming her sensuality was an intrinsic quality rather than a calculated attempt to seduce. The most haunting detail, however, is the bedroom puppet that serves as a moralistic mirror. As the night progresses, the puppet's lipstick becomes smeared and its hair tousled, symbolizing a lost innocence and a fractured domestic order. This visual monument solidified Branigan as a vocal architect capable of pushing the medium beyond commercial artifice. It was the peak of her agency, a moment where she executed her own vision against the constraints of 80s morality. Yet, as the lights of the nightclub faded, a far more profound and personal silence was beginning to settle over her life.
Silence is not an absence, it is a choice. In 1994, the music industry's most explosive engine simply turned off. This wasn't a career pivot or a calculated rebranding strategy. It was a systemic withdrawal into the most human architecture imaginable. Following the release of Over My Heart, Laura Branigan walked away from the neon glow of the Atlantic roster to face a reality that no four-octave range could shatter. Her husband, Larry Krutek, had been diagnosed with a terminal escalation of the body. For 2 years, the woman who defined the Summer Beach anthem exchanged the recording booth for the oncology ward, prioritizing a foundational partnership over the mirage of fame. This is the paradox of the caregiver. The world hears only the silence, never the labor. While Branigan was anchored by the weight of domestic survival, the music industry underwent a fundamental reorganization. The grunge revolution of the mid-90s tore down the synth-pop hegemony she helped build, replacing high-energy gloss with the distorted angst of Seattle. When Larry passed away in 1996, the industry she attempted to re-enter was an unrecognizable anomaly. Poor management and the systemic inertia of a label that now viewed her as a legacy act rather than a living force further derailed her attempts at a resurrection.
The hiatus was not just emotional, it was physical. In 2001, at her lakeside home in Westchester, Branigan suffered a 10-foot fall from a ladder while hanging wisteria, a traumatic anomaly that resulted in 2 broken femurs and months of intensive physical therapy. It was a haunting metaphor for her career, a sudden drop from a height, followed by a grueling attempt to stand again. Even her 2002 return in the musical Love, Janis felt like a mismatch of frequencies. She excelled at the theatricality, but felt a fundamental discomfort imitating Janis Joplin's unpolished chaos. She spent her final years in a state of domestic anchoring, tending to her garden and her mother, Kathleen, who was navigating the slow architecture of Alzheimer's. The diva had become a daughter, the stage replaced by a kitchen, and the world began to treat her as a ghost of the 80s. But as the headlines faded, a biological anomaly was already quieting the atmosphere inside her own mind.
In the high-gloss theater of celebrity, time is not a linear progression. It is a commodity to be traded. For decades, Laura Branigan lived behind a chronological mirage, a systemic deception that shaved 5 years off her existence to preserve the industry's obsession with youthful marketability. Throughout the 1980s, official marketing materials and broadcast titans like Casey Kasem presented a birth year of 1957, though the biological reality was 1952.
This wasn't merely a vanity project, it was a fundamental requirement of the pop architecture, a mirage that prioritized the fresh face over the experienced soul. It was only after her passing that a thorough review by the Associated Press established the true timeline of the girl from Armonk. The woman who sang with the sob of a lifetime had been performing a youth that was, in every legal and public sense, a fiction. This preoccupation with the external image may have inadvertently masked a fatal internal breakdown. In August 2004, the warnings arrived in the form of persistent, localized pressure. For approximately 2 weeks, Branigan complained of heavy headaches that refused to subside. Yet, having spent a career ignoring hecklers and surviving the sieges of Atlantic Records, she sought no medical intervention. The paradox is haunting. At 52, she was just beginning to dip her toe back into the musical landscape. She was recording raw, haunting covers of ABBA and Eva Cassidy, material that finally promised to showcase her voice without the synthetic filters of the corporate 1980s. She was reclaiming her agency, just as the vessel was beginning to fail.
On August 26, 2004, the clock reached its final second. Laura Branigan passed away in her sleep at her home in East Quogue, New York. The cause was an undiagnosed ventricular brain aneurysm, a silent internal predator that had been ticking behind her eyes while she mapped out her return to the stage. The shock was absolute. A voice that could dominate the Hot 100 for 36 weeks was silenced by a single ruptured artery. The mirage had finally faded, leaving only a modest catalog and a series of what-ifs. But while the woman was gone, the Gloria phenomenon was preparing for a resurrection that would prove some legacies are simply too loud to stay buried. The Long Island Sound swallowed her ashes in 2004, but it could not drown the signal. Legacy is often a quiet accumulation of royalties and nostalgia, but for Laura Branigan, it became a systemic catalyst for a modern resurrection. In 2019, 37 years after its initial siege of the Billboard charts, Gloria underwent an organic transmutation. The St. Louis Blues, an NHL team positioned as a statistical anomaly at the bottom of the league, adopted the track as their victory anthem. This was not a calculated marketing campaign by the house that Ahmed built. It was a grassroots eruption of the Branigan spirit. The numerical synchronicity of this resurrection is haunting. The St. Louis Blues won their first Stanley Cup in 52 years, the exact number of years Laura Branigan lived. As the city erupted into a Play Gloria fever, the song was no longer a relic of 1982, it was a living architecture of triumph. This phenomenon propelled the track back onto the digital charts, proving that the technical engine of her voice possessed a durability that the industry's talent-free dance divas could never replicate. The song had outlived the singer, the manager, and the very era that tried to categorize it.
Beyond the ice, the Branigan architecture persists in the liminal spaces of digital media. From the neon-soaked streets of Grand Theft Auto Vice City to the cinematic pulse of Flashdance, her work continues to define the sensory reality of urban escape. This cultural durability is maintained by the legacy management of Other Half Entertainment, ensuring that the vocal firepower Gordon Elliott once marveled at remains accessible to a generation that never saw the wisteria vines of East Quogue. The Gloria phenomenon serves as the final triumph over the mirage of the 1980s, a proof that technical mastery eventually outlasts the predatory capitalism that seeks to commodify it. Consequently, the narrative of Laura Branigan ends not with a headache in the dark, but with a roar in a stadium. It is a victory of the biological over the synthetic, a final note that echoes across decades to remind us of the woman who navigated the lights with self-control. But as the stadium lights dim and the anthem fades, we are left with the fundamental question of the artist's true cost. What remains when the music stops, and the in her own words promise is finally fulfilled?
Laura Branigan was more than a soundtrack to the 1980s. She was a vocal architect who used her training to build a cathedral of sound in a world made of cardboard. Her career was a series of navigations through the shyness of youth, the legal warfare of the music industry, and the silent heartbreak of personal loss. She proved that a voice with a sob could be a tool of immense power, a chiaroscuro of light and dark that defined the emotional landscape of an entire decade. She stood at the center of a systemic hegemony that prized the mirage of youth over the reality of the instrument, yet her technical anchor allowed her to outlast the very structures that sought to commodify her.
The Gloria she sang was about a woman who was running, but in the end, it was Branigan herself who stopped, leaving us to wonder what more she could have achieved had the house that Armonk built actually protected its most talented inhabitant. Her resurrection through the play Gloria phenomenon proves that a masterpiece is never truly silenced. It merely waits for a new architecture to house it. Is the enduring resonance of a single voice enough to correct the systemic erasers of history? Or are we only now beginning to hear the true depth of what she was trying to tell us in her own words? The answer lies in the silence between the notes, where the mirage of fame ends and the fundamental reality of the artist begins.